Hey, welcome back. I'm Jude. This is going to be just a general overview of trauma and how we can heal from trauma and how meditation can be a part of that healing from trauma, or not, how we can heal from trauma without meditating as well. So when I started my psychotherapy practice, I started seeing clients with trauma. I had a pretty good idea of how you heal from trauma. I'd already read a lot of books about it. I'd had classes on it. I'd had my own personal experiences. I'd seen other people in psychotherapy group activity do their own healing. So I had a pretty good idea. This is how we heal from trauma. But when you actually start seeing a diverse set of clients and you actually start seeing what's happening with each individual, what works, what doesn't work for them, it really makes it clear that everybody heals in their own unique way. And there are certain consistencies, there are certain things that are true for most people or even all people, but there's a lot of differences. So I want to do a general overview of my perspective, which is going to be, this is a huge topic, so it's a very kind of limited, focused perspective of how I see and understand healing happening. And then I'll also offer some resources at the end that will be very helpful, resources I've seen dramatically help people on their healing journeys. So the first thing is to understand, what do we mean by trauma? And we can use a simple definition that trauma is any experience that feels too big for somebody to fully process or to fully integrate. This is why two people can have the exact same experience and one person gets traumatic symptoms and the other person doesn't. Because for probably a multitude of reasons, some people can process, they can be open, they can feel all the emotions that an experience brings up and more or less process that. Whereas other people, it feels too much, it's overwhelming, and then they contract, they shut down. And that contraction is what causes the trauma symptoms. I have another video on equanimity where I talk about how people can be more resilient or less resilient to trauma. Why some people can have these big experiences, feel safe to experience them, while other people can't. So check out that video for more on that particular topic. But we could just say for now, any experience that someone doesn't feel safe or capable of fully having can or does result in trauma. And I also want to say that some people differentiate like big T trauma, capital T trauma, versus like a small t trauma, because there's lots of little things that we might not feel safe to experience that may result in some traumatic symptoms. And that might be quite different than these much larger things. And I really think that it's impossible to grow up without a certain degree of trauma. So there's definitely no shame or blame in trauma. I don't think there ever should be. It's really a universal experience. We all have experiences in our lives, especially while we're young, that just feel too much for us, especially being a child. Like, the world is crazy, it's difficult, it's challenging, tons of unexpected things happening. We want all of these things and we can't have them. And inevitably, we have emotional experiences that are overwhelming or seem too much for us. And so the type of trauma that you see mostly is actually complex trauma. It's trauma that there's been multiple experiences through someone's lives that felt like they were too much to experience, as opposed to like a single incidence trauma where there was one thing, like a car accident or an assault or someone going off to war and having just one experience that was traumatic. So either way, whether it's that single experience trauma or complex trauma, the healing is generally the same, or at least the same principles apply. In the first step, the most important thing is safety, is feeling more safe to go in and experience what was previously too much to experience. So in trauma therapies, they call this developing resources. Your resources are what gives you a feeling of safety. So this could be your friendships, your relationships, your relationship with your therapist if you have one. It could also be your meditation practice. As I was saying, meditation can be a part of healing. In this way, meditation can give us a place where we can be really present and connected to ourselves and really just start to feel more safe to exist, more safe to be in our own skin. Now, the reality here is that a lot of people really don't feel safe. They don't have these relationships to make them feel safe. They don't have maybe the financial stability to make them feel safe. They don't have the social network, the trust in friends. There are plenty of reasons to not feel safe, and you come across this all the time. This is very common. And so it doesn't need to be perfect, but the more safe we can feel, the better. And it is so unique to each person for what can make them feel more safe. And the more safe you can feel in your life, in your own skin, in your relationships, the easier or more effectively you're going to heal from the trauma. So that's the first step, is finding that safety and finding that path where you feel more and more safe in your life, finding the practices that do it for you. There are somatic practices, there are meditation practices, and then there's just general like hobbies you may have that actually make you feel more safe in yourself, more safe in your own skin. As you're healing from the trauma, you want to be tracking this safety. How safe do you feel with your therapist or your friends or whatever these different categories of your life are? How safe do you feel in them? And you want to be working towards feeling more safe. And you don't want to be fooling yourself. You don't want to be pretending you're safe when you're not. You want to be developing a real embodied sense of safety. So that's the first step. And it's not clear. For everybody, it's unique. Some people, it means finding better work, finding a job that they feel more safe in. For other people, it's really about their relationships. It's maybe family relationships, or maybe with their partner or with their friends, feeling safe to really fully express themselves, to be really truly honest with how they feel. And so if you're on your own healing journey, this is something that you should be regularly asking yourself, which is, where do you feel more safe? How do you feel more safe? And to really be exploring in your life how you can feel more grounded in yourself. Meditation can be great for this, right? Because you're just being present, and it's kind of like exposure therapy, where at first you might feel uneasy just being present with yourself. But as you sit in that uneasiness, you become more and more comfortable. You become accustomed to that, and you start realizing, okay, this way that your body is reacting and feels uneasy, feels maybe a little anxious, that's okay. And as you start to accept it and be more okay with it, it starts to subside, and you eventually come more and more grounded into yourself. You start to be able to be more present and feel more safe, to just be present with what you're feeling and whatever feelings arise throughout your life. So once you develop more of this safety, or as you're developing this safety, then you want to go and feel all of this backlog of unprocessed feelings. So in therapy, that therapeutic relationship is the container that you feel safe in, that you're able to confront these feelings, you're able to express them. And often in therapy, you do this just by talking, just by telling the story of what happened. And the idea is you want to slow down, and you want to be able to tell the story and be with the feelings as they're arising. So let's say you got in a car accident, you had this one traumatic incident. Often when people just start thinking of something that was traumatic, they might start reacting. Anxiety might come up, the body might start contracting. And so you want to just take your time and go slowly and be present with all of the body's reactivity. You want to acknowledge it, allow it to be okay, and start to feel more safe for your body to just do its thing. And so everybody, again, here is unique, where some people really can process all of the feelings just by telling the story, just by recounting what happened, and by sitting with the emotions that come up. For some people, it's more helpful to have a more somatically oriented practice, where you're really focused on what's happening in the body and you're really present with it. And this is especially true for more severe cases of trauma. So there's a lot of somatic modalities which are probably leading the way when it comes to trauma treatment. And there's lots of somatic exercises, and I'll give some recommendations at the end for resources. The somatic exercises are different ways of feeling more safe in your body and allowing your body to have a more complete experience of what it previously didn't feel safe to experience. So yes, healing from trauma is uncomfortable, because it means going into what we previously did not feel safe to go into, or feeling what we previously did not feel safe to feel. And so you want to take your time. You don't want to pressure yourself or feel pressured by others to go fast or to heal it, because that could just incur more trauma. I learned in my early days as a therapist that there was a few clients, one in particular, I went too fast. We started talking about this. She was willing to talk about these experiences in her childhood, and it became too much for her. It was bringing up too much anxiety in her life, too much of the contraction, and she stopped doing therapy. And that was a big lesson for me, to really be patient and take your time and really make sure the person knows that that is important, that there is no rush, and to track the reactivity that's arising, to notice when they're getting more contracted, when anxiety, distress is coming up, and to really honor that and to really find the ways to come back, to slow down, to come back to whatever practices or relationships make that person feel more safe. So it's essentially this, that we develop a sense of safety, which can take many forms, so we can have a more complete experience of whatever wasn't fully experienced before. That is essentially how we heal from trauma. But that being said, it looks so different in everyone that I've done the work with. And for some people, it's really hinged a lot on what's happening in other aspects of their life. And so this is something I see a lot, is that as people start to find a more meaningful day-to-day life, as they start to not accept the things that they don't like in their lives, like let's say leave a toxic workplace or leave a toxic relationship, and as they start finding what's more aligned with who they are, this gives a much deeper sense of safety, which really allows this to unfold. So sometimes it will be people finding like more secure employment or more secure relationships that will give them that groundedness to actually do this traumatic work. And sometimes the work will actually start happening organically. The feelings will just start arising in their being, like just they'll have days where they're overcome with emotions. And so the practice is to just be open, to give space for these emotions to come up. Now, of course, there's appropriate times and places to process emotions, and there's less appropriate times. So it doesn't mean that if you're at work, you have to allow all these emotions to come up. But if the emotions start coming up, you do want to create space somewhere in your life where you feel safe to process them. And so the most accessible way is likely to have a therapist or a friend that you really trust, that you can just talk about what is coming up emotionally, and they can just be there just to witness it. And this is the thing. They're not trying to give you advice or reframe the situation. They're just trying to let you emotionally process. They're just there listening and witnessing as you go through your emotional processing or purging. That being said, what you'll find a lot of the time with trauma is these really unhelpful, negative, kind of self-defeating attitudes, shame, these views that are really unhelpful. And this is where it can be really helpful to have a therapist or friend reframe this. So people will often blame themselves for things. They'll have shame around things that have happened to them. And this is where it can be really powerful to express it, because the healing of shame, I have a whole video on shame on my channel and how we can heal from shame. So you can check that out. But the healing of shame comes from being willing to experience it and even being seen in it. Because the shame wants to contract and hide. And so by exposing it, by saying, hey, I feel this shame around this thing that happened, we're really countering that kind of shame contraction, and we're expanding, we're opening, we're letting this all out, and that can be hugely healing. So beyond just the processing of emotions, we want to get our mind right, our whole framework of understanding what happened in a way that is self-compassionate, right? So we don't want to be blaming ourselves. And this is so common that people blame themselves, or they have shame, like there's something wrong with them. They have all these beliefs around this trauma. So what you want to do is you want to look at, what did you make all of that mean? So these things happen to you, these bad things, these traumatic things happen to you. And what did you make it mean? What did you make it mean about you? What did you make it mean about others? And part of the trauma work is untangling that, and to start to see that you're not a bad person, that you're not at fault, and that you are essentially good enough. Because this is probably the most common thing I hear of people with trauma, have this belief that they're just not good enough, that there's something inherently wrong with them, that they don't measure up. And this is one of the things I love about Buddhism, is it recognizes inherent goodness, that we are good. We have this inherent goodness, and that's just our nature in the deepest sense, but it gets obscured. But we can come back and start to recognize that. And when we see the bigger picture, when we can recount our life story and see how we're not really at fault for a lot of the things that happened to us, or at least how we were young, how we didn't have the proper support, guidance, education, all of that, we can start to be more self-compassionate, and we can start to see what happened to us in a self-compassionate lens. And that is a massively important piece to healing. So it's safety, it's being willing to feel, practice feeling discomfort, all the uncomfortable emotions, having a self-compassionate view, and then rewriting the whole story around it, around who's at fault, or how you interpret it in a way that made yourself to blame, that maybe created shame. And so that's it. And it really looks so different for different people. And yes, you can get a therapist, but people have often healed trauma just through friends. A lot of people have healed trauma just conversationally from processing it with friends that they really trust and feel safe with. Last thing to keep in mind is that the healing process isn't linear. It's not like you do a few sessions and every time things get better. Things, as you start to go into this stuff, things will get worse and then they'll get better and worse. This is called titration, how we go back and forth. And the idea is that as you go into the discomfort and then you come back to safety, you go on this back and forth. That process leads to this inner learning. So you become more trusting, or you feel more safe to go into the discomfort because you know you can come back to the safety. So going a little bit into the discomfort, a little bit into the emotions, and then coming back and grounding and feeling safe in your body, that is probably one of the core skills that needs to be practiced. The other thing to keep in mind is the window of tolerance, which is essentially the window in which you are okay to be uncomfortable. So the window of tolerance, there's essentially when you're not activated, when you're in numbness or not feeling, and then you start feeling and you're able to be present with the discomfort, present with the distress. And then it gets to the top of the window where it starts becoming too much. And so you really want to track when you're getting towards the top. And when it starts to become too much, you need to learn how to bring yourself back down. And you want to be in that middle zone where you're uncomfortable, but you're able to be present. You're able to be open. You're not fully contracted with what's happening. And so that may take some practice, and there's lots of somatic exercise. Again, I'll give resources at the end that can help with this process. Okay, I think that's a good start. This is a huge topic. There's a lot of really great resources on it. So the first ones I'm going to mention, I think for complex trauma, there's a great book called C-PTSD, Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving by Pete Walker. And this is the book, I think, more than any other, that people read and it's resonant. Because Pete Walker, he's a psychotherapist, but he healed his own complex trauma. And so the book is deeply personal and it really resonates with people. I can't tell you how many clients I've recommended it to who have come back and just told me that they were crying with every page. They were just like crying through reading the whole book because it brought up so much and they felt so seen and they felt like a lot less shame around how they were because it really explains so much in their lives. It offered so much insight that was able to bring up more self-compassion. So I think that's usually the first book I recommend to people. Pete Walker has this kind of 3-tiered system around healing complex trauma. It's shrinking the inner critic. And as an aside, although his advice is good on shrinking the inner critic, it's actually, I prefer IFS, internal family systems. I feel like it goes a lot deeper. I have a video on my channel around inner critic that you can check out as well. That is really inspired by the IFS way of doing it. And then the other pillar of the system is grieving the lost childhood, which is obviously huge, like grieving just the childhood in general. There's a real grieving that needs to happen for healing to happen. And then the third piece is somatic. It's the body-oriented stuff. It's understanding how our body reacts to trauma and how all of this impacts us and how we can heal through feeling. So Pete Walker, highly recommend his work. He actually has a few other books that are interesting as well. One that's really personal, about his own personal journey. Another one called The Tao of Fully Feeling. The next resource is the other one that I probably recommend the most, which is called Healing Trauma by Peter Levine. Now, Peter Levine has many books on healing trauma. He is really probably the pioneer in this field when it comes to somatic healing of trauma. He founded somatic experiencing. It's a really great modality, but now there are a lot of other modalities like sensory motor therapy and just who knows how many other somatic modalities of healing. But Peter Levine really was one of the first ones to be really pioneering this type of work, working with the body. And his work is great. While he has more complete books, the book Healing Trauma is very direct. It's a very concise, kind of boiled down version of his work that he really just puts it all out. And the best thing about the book is it comes with like a CD. I got the physical book. It comes with a physical CD. And the CD has guided audio practices. The practices are so fantastic around, coming more into your body, feeling more grounded, being able to name what's happening in your body, connecting with the feelings. The somatic practices are great. I often give clients like a version of these somatic practices, just the audio guided practices, and to do at home. And they've also reported that just reading about the theory and the understanding have really helped them not feel so weird and not feel so ashamed of their symptoms, right? Of how they're behaving. It really leads to a lot of understanding. So Healing Trauma by Peter Levine, that's the next recommendation. Now the big book on healing trauma, the really popular one, Bessel van Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score. Now Bessel is like the leading expert in the world in trauma healing, just in the sense that he literally wrote like the textbook on healing traumatic stress like back in the 80s. And he's really kept up with all of the research. Like this guy is on top of it when it comes to looking at what everybody in the field is doing and really bringing it all together in this book. So the book is, without a doubt, the best overview of somatic psychotherapy because it really touches on many different ways of healing. It doesn't go super deep into any modality, but it does go deep enough to really be of a lot of value. So this book is great. It really helped me in my early stages of practice working with clients. And it's just a great book. Now, just a recommendation, some of the earlier chapters get more into like the science, the physiological things around trauma. And at a certain point, I was just kind of like, yeah, I've had enough of these chapters, and I skipped. And for me, chapter 5 is where it really got good, where you really got into how we actually heal from these things, not just what are they physiologically, but how do we experience these things and how can we heal through our experiences. So the book really gets into that, gives a lot of examples. So don't get overwhelmed by all of the sciencey stuff if it's not your thing. But that stuff is great and it is relatable, but feel free to like skip forward in the book to just get to the healing stuff, if that's what you want to do. The last resource I'll give is the one directly on meditation and healing trauma. It's called Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness. It's by David Treleaven. I don't know if I pronounced his name right. And he's really fantastic. He did his PhD thesis on this topic, which he then kind of wrote the book based on the research he did. And he's really a leader in the field when it comes to meditation and trauma. A lot of meditation teachers really didn't understand trauma before, and they were really giving bad advice when it came to people's traumatic symptoms coming up, because there's this idea in meditation, oh, just go more into that, just sit with it, just surrender to it. And they didn't really understand how we can build resources and kind of strengthen our ability to be present with discomfort. So his book is very much a very good approach to the challenges that come up. And then it gives real meditation advice around how to cope with traumatic things. And so I have some practices on my channel some that are kind of inspired, at least partly by the book, around distress management, working with distress in meditation. How to get grounded first. That gives some of the strategies he talks about in the book, but the book is much more complete. It talks about a lot more strategies and, gives a lot of examples. So Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness, excellent book. Highly recommend it as well if meditation is your thing, or if you want to bring meditation in as part of your healing, which it can be super helpful for. In fact, like extremely helpful. But just make sure you're doing it in a helpful way where you're feeling more safe and grounded in your body. And like, this is what it's all about. This is the litmus test. Do you feel more safe to be present with what you're feeling or not? And that's how you know if you're making progress. And again, progress is not linear. Some days is going to be more, it's going to be better, you're going to feel more safe. Some days less so, and that's all okay. It's more about this big picture of, are you doing the work? Are you, working towards more safety, or, working towards having more complete, more full emotional experiences? So again, self-compassion is key. Take your time. By rushing things, you could actually make things worse. So it's really essential to take your time and check out the resources. And that's it for this video. Let me know if you have any questions. Please feel free to leave comments or more resources or anything. I love reading the comments. I really appreciate that. And see you next time.